and welcome again to Noetic Resonance. This episode is brought to you by our game Overrated with our fake sponsor, a taco truck on the corner. 2 out of 5 stars. I overheard an employee refer to me as that Pillsbury Doughboy looking ass. It's okay. They're right. I love this game. It is freaking hilarious. Welcome back. This is episode 1 of season 2. It's called Sacred Waters, What Every Tradition Knew and Science is Remembering. This episode is for educational and spiritual purposes only. Nothing shared here constitutes medical advice. As we move through this conversation about water, I want to be clear about the different kinds of ground we are standing on at different moments. Some of what I share is established in peer-reviewed science. The physical properties of water, its biological role, its behavior at the molecular level, I will present that as fact because it is. But some of what I share is serious but still emerging or contested scientific research. Dr. Gerald Pollack, professor of bioengineering at the University of Washington, has published peer-reviewed work on what he calls exclusion zone or easy water, a structured fourth phase of water that forms at interfaces and generates an electrical charge. His work is published and has attracted genuine scientific engagement, but is not yet fully accepted by mainstream biology. Dr. Mu-Shik Jeon, thank you again as always for the pronunciations. I do try my best for y'all. He's a South Korean chemist with nearly 300 published scientific papers, spent 40 years researching hexagonal water structure and its relationship to cellular health. His work is serious and credentialed and also sits outside mainstream scientific consensus. I will present both as what they are, compelling and carefully conducted research worth engaging with honestly. Some of what I share comes from more speculative territory. Dr. James DeMiho holds a PhD in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, and his water research is conducted through the framework of Wilhelm Reich's orgone energy theory, which has not been validated by mainstream peer-reviewed science. His observations about water's responsiveness to energetic environments are interesting, and I will present them as such, clearly labeled as outside established science. And some of what I share is cross-traditional spiritual wisdom, documented history, and my own interpretive read. I will tell you clearly when I am speaking from historical record and when I am speaking from my own discernment. My goal is to always give you the most honest picture I can of what we actually know, what we are still learning, and what we are choosing to believe. As always, take what resonates, investigate what challenges you, and release what was never yours to carry. Think for just a moment, if you can, about the last time you stood at the edge of something large. An ocean, a river, a lake at dusk, or maybe just a rainstorm that caught you off guard and you stood in it longer than you needed to. I want you to think about what happened in your body in that moment, because most people, when they are honest about it, describe something that goes beyond the physical. A recognition, a settling, something that feels less like encountering a substance and more like encountering a presence. You have been having that response to water your entire life. So has every human who has ever lived. And so has every tradition, every culture, every spiritual framework across the full breadth of human recorded history. Not one of them looked at water and called it ordinary. Not one. And the more we learn about what actually is at the molecular level, the stranger and more extraordinary it becomes. This episode is about that convergence, the place where the oldest human intuitions about water and the newest scientific investigations into what water actually does meet and begin carefully and honestly to speak to the same language. We are going to look at what established science knows about water's genuine anomalous properties. We are going to sit with the work of researchers who are pushing into contested and emerging territory around water's capacity to structure, to respond, and to hold information. We are going to travel through water traditions of cultures across the world and ask what they understood that we are only beginning to find the language for. And we are going to ask what it means for how we live, how we pray, how we speak, and how we heal, that the substance we are primarily made of may be far more alive and responsive than we were taught to believe. As always, I will tell you clearly what is established fact, what is emerging research, and what is my own interpretive read. You deserve that honesty, and water deserves that care. To understand why every tradition across human history looked at water and called it sacred, it helps to start with what water actually is at the molecular level. Because when you look closely, water is already the strangest substance on earth before we ever get to the consciousness or intention or the divine. It defies the standard rules of physics in ways that are not subtle. They are foundational. And they are the reason life as we know it is possible at all. Most substances contract and become denser when they freeze. Water expands. This is not a minor quirk. This is a categorical violation of how matter is supposed to behave. And because water expands when it freezes, ice floats. If water behaved like every other substance, ice would sink. Oceans would freeze from the bottom up. Life in bodies of water would be impossible. The entire thermal regulation of the planet's surface would be different. The fact that you can ice fish, the fact that aquatic life survives winter, the fact that the oceans have not become solid rock, all of it depends on a single anomaly. Water also has an extraordinarily high specific heat capacity, meaning it takes a massive amount of energy to heat it up or cool it down compared to almost any other substance. This is why the oceans buffer global temperatures, absorbing heat in summer and releasing it slowly in winter, moderating the climate of entire continents. It is also why your body temperature does not wildly spike or plunge when you move between environments. The water in your tissues is doing thermal stabilization work constantly and silently. And then there is the density maximum. Water reaches its greatest density not at freezing point, but at exactly 4 degrees Celsius, which is 39.2 degrees Fahrenheit. As it cools below that toward freezing, it actually becomes less dense and rises rather than sinking. This means that when a lake or pond freezes, the coldest water stays at the surface to form ice, while the slightly warmer, denser water at 4 degrees settles to the bottom. Aquatic life survives winter in that insulated sanctuary at the bottom of frozen bodies of water because water refused to follow the rules every other substance follows. These are not minor curiosities. They are the conditions that make complex life on this planet possible. Water also has the highest surface tension of all common liquids. This allows it to climb upward through vessels of trees against gravity through what is called capillary action, defying the standard rules of physics to carry life from the root to the leaf in the plants that can be hundreds of feet tall. It is the universal solvent, dissolving more substances than any other liquid, which is why it is the medium through which nutrients travel in every living body. It exists in all 3 states, solid, liquid, and gas, within the narrow temperature range that supports life, a range that nowhere else in the known universe is guaranteed. These are documented and peer-reviewed physical properties that make water categorically unlike any other substance we know of. Water already refuses to be ordinary at the most basic level of its chemistry. Now let us go deeper. Dr. Gerald Pollack, professor of bioengineering at the University of Washington, has spent decades investigating what he describes as a 4th phase of water beyond the 3 states we learned in school. He calls it exclusion zone water, or easy water. And his research, published in peer-reviewed journals, demonstrates that water forms a structured, electrically charged phase at interfaces, meaning wherever water meets another surface, this easy water, which he describes as H3O2 rather than the standard H2O, excludes particles and generates an electrical potential that Pollock argues functions like a biological battery. His research suggests that this structured phase of water is present in enormous quantities inside living cells, that it responds to light, particularly infrared light, and then it may play a central role in cellular energy and hydration that mainstream biology has not fully accounted for. This is serious, credentialed, peer-reviewed science. It is also contested by mainstream biology and not yet integrated into the standard scientific framework. I am presenting it as what it is: important emerging research that deserves honest engagement. Dr. Mu-Shik Jeon, a South Korean chemist who published nearly 300 scientific papers over a 40-year career, spent his life investigating what he called hexagonal water, a specific molecular arrangement of water clusters that he found surrounding healthy cells and significantly absent around cancerous ones. His molecular water environment theory, presented in 1986, proposed that the structural quality of water in and around our cells directly influences biological function. That hexagonally structured water moves through biological systems more efficiently, supports cellular metabolism more effectively, and that the loss of hexagonal water from our cells is actually a measurable feature of aging and disease. His work represents 40 years of serious scientific investigation by a credentialed researcher. It is not mainstream consensus science, but it is not fringe speculation either. It sits in the genuinely contested and genuinely interesting middle territory where some of the most important scientific discoveries eventually emerge from. Dr. James DeMiho, who holds a PhD in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, approaches water from a significantly different angle. His research draws on the framework of Wilhelm Reich's orgone energy theory, the idea that there is biological life energy that permeates living systems in the atmosphere and that water has a particular affinity for and responsiveness to this energy. DeMiho's observations about water charged inside orgone accumulators, developing measurable changes in UV absorption, sit well outside mainstream peer-reviewed science, and I want to be clear that I am presenting them as such. They are interesting, though. They are observed and documented by a credentialed researcher. They are also not validated by the mainstream scientific community and should be held with that awareness. What connects all of this research, from Pollock's easy water to John's hexagonal clusters to DeMiho's living water observations, is a shared intuition that water is not a passive carrier of things, but an active participant in biological life. That its structure matters, that its environment influences its behavior. That is more dynamic and more responsive than the simple H2O of the chemistry classroom suggests. That intuition is worth taking seriously even where the specific mechanisms remain contested. Before we look at what science is uncovering about water, it is worth sitting with what the oldest human stories understood about it. Because across every tradition and every corner of the world, water does not appear as background scenery in the story of creation. It appears as the beginning itself. In the opening verse of Genesis, before light, before land, before any living thing, the text describes a formless void and darkness over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, not creating water, hovering over water that is already there. The Hebrew word for the deep is Tehum, the primordial waters that precede the creative act. The English translation reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Water precedes the creative act in the Hebrew tradition. It is the medium out of which everything else emerges. Some scholars note that tehom appears without that definite article in Hebrew, suggesting it may function as a proper noun, a primordial entity rather than simply a body of water, and draw linguistic parallels to Tiamat, the Babylonian primordial water deity from the Enuma Elish. That is a legitimate area of academic discussion rather than a settled conclusion, and I present it as such. What is straightforwardly in the text in both Hebrew and English is that water precedes God's creative activity in Genesis 1. That much is simply what it says. In the Egyptian cosmological framework, Nun is the infinite primordial ocean that existed before creation, the indifferentiated waters of chaos and potential from which the first mound of earth arose and upon which the created world floats. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the Enuma Elish begins with Apsu and Tiamat, the mingling of fresh and salt waters, as the primordial condition from which all things come. In the Hindu tradition, the cosmic ocean of milk, Kashira Sagara, is churned by the gods and demons to produce the material of creation. In the Norse tradition, the primordial ice of Niflheim meets the fire of Muspelheim across the void, and from that meeting emerges the first life. The pattern across all of these traditions is remarkably consistent. Water is not created. Water is already there. Water is the condition that makes creation possible rather than a product of creation. And then there is the other face of water. Because sacred does not mean gentle, and the traditions knew that too. Almost every spiritual tradition on earth carries a flood narrative, and the consistency of that pattern across cultures that had no contact with one another is one of the most discussed phenomena in comparative mythology. The Sumerian account of Utnapishtim, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, predates the biblical flood narrative and shares its essential structure almost beat for beat. The Hebrew account of Noah follows the same arc. And here is a detail from that account that connects directly to something we discussed in the science section. Genesis 7:11 does not say simply that it rained. It says all the fountains of the great deep burst forth and the windows of heaven were opened. Two distinct sources of water, rain from above and fountains from the deep below. The Hebrew word for the great deep there is tihom, the same primordial deep water present before creation in Genesis 1. Ancient writers explicitly conceptualized the earth as containing subterranean waters capable of bursting upward with tremendous force. Whether they arrived at that understanding through observation, through revelation, or through both, they were describing something that primary water research is now investigating through geological science. The fountains of the great deep is not only poetry, it may be geology. In the Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a fish, later revealed to be the god Vishnu in his first avatar, to build a boat and preserve the seeds of all living things before the great flood. In the Greek tradition, Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha, survived a flood sent by Zeus to destroy a corrupt humanity and repopulate the earth. Flood narratives appear in Mesopotamian, Greek, Hindu, Hebrew, Chinese, Mayan, Aztec, and indigenous North American traditions, among many others. The specific details vary, but the underlying pattern is identical. A world that has lost its way. Water as the force that comes not to destroy for destruction's sake, but to reset, to purify through dissolution, to clear what has become corrupt, so that what must come next has ground to grow in. Ancient people did not sentimentalize water. They revered it, and reverence genuine reverence always contains both awe and fear. The same ocean that rocks you is the ocean that swallows you whole. The same river that nourishes the field is the river that takes the village when it rises. It is worth sitting with that before we move further. Because the episode we are building is not a simple celebration of water as a beautiful healing force. It is an honest encounter with something that the oldest human traditions understood to be alive, to be powerful, and to be worthy of the deepest respect we are capable of offering. When you look across the full breadth of human spiritual history, one of the most consistent things you will find is that water was never understood as an inert resource. It was understood as a presence, a living, aware, powerful presence that deserved to be approached with reverence, honored with relationship, and never taken for granted. The water deities of the world's traditions are not primitive projections of fear onto a natural phenomenon. They are sophisticated theological expressions of something humanity has consistently recognized about water. That it behaves like something that is aware, that it responds, that it holds power that exceeds what its chemistry alone can explain. In the Yoruba tradition and the African diaspora traditions that carried it across the Atlantic, two of the most powerful and widely venerated orishas are water beings. Yemanja, whose name means mother, whose children are like fish, is the orisha of the ocean, the great mother of waters, the womb from which all life emerges. She is associated with the moon, with fertility, with the deepest emotional currents of human experience. Her festivals involve offerings placed into the sea, flowers and candles floating on water, and communal celebration of her as the divine feminine source of all living things. Oshun governs freshwater, rivers, streams, fertility, love, beauty, and abundance. She is considered one of the most powerful and approachable of the orishas. The fact that both of these traditions survived the Middle Passage and took root in Brazil as candomblé, in Cuba as santeria, and across the Caribbean is itself a testament to the depth and resilience of what they carry. Water held the memory of the tradition even when everything else was taken. In ancient Egypt, water was not separate from the divine, but was one of its primary expressions. Nun, the primordial ocean, was a divine force. Tefnut, goddess of moisture and rain, was among the first beings to emerge from the primordial state, and her tears were said to have created the first humans. Hapi, the god of the annual Nile flood, was one of the most beloved and practically important deities in the Egyptian pantheon because the flood was the source of the agricultural fertility that sustained Egyptian civilization. The Nile was not simply a river. It was a divine being whose annual rising and receding was understood as a sacred rhythm. In Hindu tradition, Varuna is one of the oldest Vedic deities, governing water, the cosmic ocean, the moral law that holds the universe together, and the waters of truth and justice. Ganga is perhaps the most intimately beloved of the Hindu water deities, the goddess who is the river Ganges herself, whose waters are considered to carry the power of purification and liberation. To bathe in the Ganga is to wash away accumulated karma. To have one's ashes scattered in her waters is to be released toward liberation. In the Celtic tradition, water was understood as one of the primary thresholds between the visible and invisible worlds. Sacred wells and springs throughout Britain and Ireland were considered portals to the other world. The goddess Coventina, associated with a sacred spring in northern Britain, was venerated as a deity of healing, prophecy, and abundance. Offerings were cast into sacred wells as acts of communion with the divine presence understood to inhabit them, a practice so deeply embedded in the population that the institutional church spent centuries trying to suppress it and largely failed. In Japanese Shinto tradition, water kami, divine spirits, are present in rivers, lakes, waterfalls, rain, and the ocean. Ryujin, the dragon king of the sea, governs the tides and the depths of the ocean from a palace beneath the waves. Suijin is the kami of water more broadly. Water purification, called misogi, is one of the foundational Shinto ritual practices. Standing under a waterfall or immersing oneself in natural water as an act of spiritual cleansing and renewal. In the indigenous traditions of Turtle Island, what many call North America, water is understood not as a resource but as a relative, a living relation deserving of the same respect and reciprocity as any other member of the community of life. The Anishinaabe tradition holds water as sacred, and the responsibility of women in particular to speak for and protect it. Water ceremonies, water songs, and water walks are living practices in many indigenous communities today, not historical artifacts, but active expressions of a relationship with water that has never been severed. The Lakota concept of mitakuya oyasin, all my relations, encompasses the water as a living relative whose well-being is inseparable from human well-being. Mesopotamia, Enki, also known as Ea, was the god of fresh water, wisdom, magic, and creation. His domain was the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean believed to be the source of all rivers and springs. What is extraordinary when you lay all of these traditions alongside each other is the consistency of what water represents across cultures that had no contact with one another. Water is the origin. Water is the threshold between worlds. Water is the purifier. Water is the womb from which life comes and the grave to which it returns. Water is the medium through which the divine makes itself known in the physical world. And water is a living presence deserving of relationship, not a passive resource available for unlimited extraction. Not one of these traditions arrived at a mechanical or merely utilitarian understanding of water. Every one of them recognized in water something that exceeded its chemistry. That recognition, preserved across the full diversity of human spiritual expression, deserves to be taken seriously as the longest running and most cross-culturally consistent investigation into the nature of water that humanity has ever conducted. We are now moving into territory that requires the most careful and honest framing of anything we have covered so far in this episode, because the work of Masaru Emoto and Veda Austin is genuinely fascinating, genuinely provocative, and also genuinely contested in ways that matter and that you deserve to know clearly before you decide what to do with it. Masaru Emoto was a Japanese author and researcher who spent decades photographing water crystals after exposing water samples to different words, music, prayers, and intentions. His photographs, published in books like The Hidden Messages in Water, show what appear to be strikingly beautiful and symmetrical crystal formations in water exposed to words like love and gratitude, and distorted or fragmented formations in waters exposed to words like hate or anger. His work became enormously influential in spiritual and wellness communities worldwide and is frequently cited as scientific proof that water responds to human consciousness and intention. I want to be honest with you about what the scientific community has said about Emoto's methodology because that's honestly important. His experiments lacked the controls that peer-reviewed science requires. They were not double-blind, meaning the people selecting which crystals to photograph knew which samples had been exposed to which words. Reproducibility has been inconsistent. The mainstream scientific community has not validated his findings, and several attempts to replicate them under controlled conditions have not produced the same results. That does not mean that his observations were fabricated or meaningless. It means that they have not been established as scientific fact and should not be presented as such. It is also worth acknowledging why his work captured the global imagination so powerfully despite the scientific pushback. His photographs gave humanity a visual vocabulary for something enormous numbers of people already felt to be true at an intuitive level. That the words we speak carry weight, that our intentions have formatting power, that what we direct toward living systems matters in a way that go beyond merely psychological. Whether his photographs function as rigorous data or as intuitive illustration, and the honest answer is that they function more as the latter than the former, they opened a conversation that needed to be opened. That is not nothing. That is actually significant. The question his work raised is more important than the methodology he used to raise it. What is worth sitting with is the question his work raises rather than the conclusion it claims. If water is as structurally dynamic as Pollock and John's research suggests, if it forms different molecular arrangements depending on its environment, then the question of whether human intention constitutes a meaningful environment influence on water structure is not an absurd question. It is an open one. It has simply not been answered by rigorous science yet. That is a very different thing from it having been answered negatively. Veda Austin is a contemporary New Zealand researcher who photographs water in its crystalline state after exposing it to focused thought and intention. Her images show what appear to be remarkably specific crystalline formations that seem to correspond to the intentions directed at the water during freezing. Her work is striking and her documentation is careful within her own methodology. It has not been peer-reviewed and has not been subjected to the kind of controlled experimental conditions that would allow mainstream science to evaluate it. She is transparent about this and represents her work as observation and invitation to inquiry rather than as proven science. What both Emoto and Austin are pointing toward, whatever the status of their specific methodologies, is a question that the convergence of water science and ancient spiritual tradition keeps surfacing from different directions. Is water responsive to its environment in ways that go beyond what we currently have the tools to measure and verify? Ancient traditions across every culture we examined answered that question with an unambiguous yes, and built entire cosmological and ritual frameworks around that answer. Pollock's research establishes that water structure is far more dynamic and environmentally responsive than standard chemistry acknowledges. John's research suggests that the structural quality of water has measurable biological consequences. DeMio's observation suggests that energetic environments influence water's measurable properties in ways that remain outside mainstream explanation. Emoto and Austin push that question into the territory of human consciousness specifically and ask whether the most intimate and personal of environments, the field of human thought and intention and prayer, might be one of the environmental influences that water responds to. I cannot tell you that is proven. I can tell you it is one of the most important open questions at the intersection of water science and human spiritual practice. Sit with that question. Investigate the work yourself, especially for Veda Austin. She presents hundreds to thousands of pictures along with her research, showing how it's done. She also put out there how she does her methods so you can do them yourself at your own home and see what results you get. And hold with it the honest uncertainty it deserves while remaining genuinely open to what it might mean. Across virtually every spiritual tradition we have examined, water appears not only as a source of life, but as a boundary, a threshold. The place where what is visible and what is invisible becomes permeable to each other. The understanding is so consistent across cultures that had no contact with one another that it deserves to be named in its own distinct pattern. In the Celtic tradition, sacred wells and springs were understood as portals to the other world. The deeper reality that underlies and interpenetrates the visible one. People traveled significant distances to sit at these wells, to lower offerings into them, to speak their needs into the water and trust that water carried those needs somewhere beyond ordinary hearing. The institutional church spent centuries trying to suppress well veneration across Britain and Ireland through formal prohibitions and theological arguments and largely failed. which tells you something significant about the depth of the conviction it was trying to dislodge. In the Greek tradition, the river Styx was the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead. Oaths sworn by the Styx were the most binding in the Greek cosmos, more binding than any other oath because the Styx carried the authority of the boundary between worlds. In the Egyptian tradition, the Nile functioned as a threshold, the boundary between the ordered world of the living on the east bank and the realm of the dead on the west bank, oriented toward the setting sun. Egyptian funerary practices were built around this geography of water as the line between life and death. In the Hebrew tradition, the river Jordan functions as a threshold throughout the biblical narrative. It is the boundary between wilderness and the promised land, crossed by the Israelites under Joshua. It is the water in which Jesus is baptized at the beginning of his public ministry, the threshold moment between his private and public life. In the Norse tradition, the world tree Yggdrasil stands at the center of the cosmos with its roots reaching into three wells. The well of Erd, where the Norns weave fate, the well of Mimir, which holds cosmic wisdom and from which Odin sacrificed his eye to drink, and the well of Hexagonal, from which rivers flow through all the worlds. Water in the Norse framework is the carrier of fate, of wisdom, and of the connective tissue between realms. In indigenous traditions across the world, water consistently marks the threshold between the ordinary and the sacred. Vision quests often involve time near water as a part of the liminal period between the ordinary self and whatever the seeker is moving toward. Water ceremonies mark birth, coming of age, marriage, death, and the transitions between seasons because water is the element that knows how to carry a person from one shore to another. What is interesting about this cross-traditional convergence is that it aligns with something water does at the physical level that we now understand better than previous generations did. Water is the universal solvent. It dissolves boundaries between substances more effectively than any other liquid. It is the medium through which different things become permeable to each other. It is the substance in which the barrier between inside and outside a cell is most actively negotiated. At the molecular level, water is the original threshold substance, the thing that makes the boundary between one thing and another both real and crossable. The ancient traditions that called water a portal between worlds may have been pointing through the language of myth and ritual at something about water's actual physical nature that they had no other vocabulary to describe. There is a question worth sitting with before we go any further into what water means for the human body specifically. Where does water actually come from? The answer you learned in school is hydrological cycle, rainfalls, filters through the ground, collects in aquifers and rivers and oceans, it evaporates, becomes clouds, and it falls again. That cycle is real and it is well documented. But there is another category of water that the mainstream scientific conversation has been relatively quiet about: primary water. Primary water refers to water that is generated from within the earth itself through geological processes deep in the mantle. The combination of hydrogen and oxygen under extreme heat and pressure producing water that has never been part of the surface hydrological cycle. It does not come from rain. It emerges from within the earth as an ongoing generative process. The researcher Stephen Rice documented primary water sources extensively in the mid-20th century and demonstrated that water is being produced from within the earth independently of everything we thought we knew about where water comes from. I want to be clear that primary water research sits outside the mainstream hydrology, and it has not been incorporated into the scientific standard framework. It is documented observation by a credentialed researcher that has not received mainstream scientific validation. Imagine that. How much research do you think they do into some of these things that people are discovering? What it suggests, though, if taken seriously, is significant. The earth is not simply a rock that water sits on top of. The earth may generate water from within itself as a continuous process. And here is where this connects directly to something ancient writers understood. In Genesis 7:11, like we talked about earlier, describing the flood, the text does not simply say that it rained. It says all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Two distinct sources of water, rain from above and fountains from the deep below. The Hebrew word for the great deep there is tehom, the same primordial deep water present before creation in Genesis 1. Ancient writers explicitly conceptualize the earth as containing subterranean waters capable of bursting upward with tremendous force. The fountains of the great deep is not only poetry, it may be geology. Now bring that understanding into the human story. Before any of us knew light, before we knew air in the way we breathe it now, before we heard sound outside the rhythmic pulse of our mother's body, we lived in water. The amniotic fluid that surrounds every developing human being is our first environment, our first home, our first experience of being in this world, our first experience of being held. We do not arrive at water as a spiritual metaphor later in life. We begin in it. Our earliest cellular differentiation, the very first moments of becoming a distinct living organism, happens in a fluid environment. Our organs form in water. Our nervous system develops in water. Our brain, which spends its entire life generating the thoughts and perceptions and spiritual experiences we call our interior life, forms itself in water. And the composition of amniotic fluid is remarkably similar in its mineral composition to seawater. We do not just emerge from our mothers. In a very real biological sense, we emerge from an ocean. The womb is not merely a metaphor for the primordial waters. The womb reproduces the primordial waters inside the body of every living person who has ever carried life. Every water deity, every creation narrative that begins with the waters, every ritual immersion that symbolizes new birth, is pointing back to something the body already knows from its very first moments of existence. Water is where life begins, not symbolically, literally. And it does not stop there. Look at everything around you that lives. Trees are approximately 50% water. Their entire architecture of root and trunk and branch and leaf designed to move water from the ground to the sky against gravity through capillary action. The fruit hanging on those trees is 80 to 95% water. The vegetables that sustain us are primarily water delivering nutrients in a water medium. Jellyfish are 95% water. The grass beneath your feet, the flowers opening to the sun, the grain that becomes your bread. Everything you consume to sustain your life is primarily water handing itself to you in a different form. And your body, which is between 60 and 70% water in its overall composition, is closer to 90% water at the cellular level where the actual work of life happens. Your blood is primarily water. Your lymph is primarily water. The fluid surrounding your brain and spine is primarily water. The tears you cry when grief finally breaks through are water carrying the chemistry of what you have been holding. Now here is the detail that stops people when they really let it land. The human brain is approximately 73% water, and the eyes are even higher. Closer to 98% water in the vitreous humor, the fluid that fills the eye and gives it its shape. The organ you use to perceive reality is almost entirely water. The organ you use to think, to feel, to dream, to pray, to generate every spiritual experience you have ever had is primarily water. Every vision, every moment of clarity, every intuitive flash, every encounter with the divine that has ever moved through your consciousness, moved through water to get there. And then bring in what Pollack's research suggests about easy water and what John's research suggests about hexagonal water surrounding healthy cells, and what Emoto and Austin's work raises as an open question about water's responsiveness to intention. If water forms different structural arrangements depending on its environment, and if the instrument of your perception and your consciousness is almost entirely made of that water, then the state of the water you are made made of is not incidental to the quality of your inner life. It may be the medium of it. Every word spoken over you since childhood did not just register as psychological content in the way we typically understand memory. It landed in water, in your brain, your eyes, your blood, your cells, all of it in water receiving what is spoken into it. The mystics across every tradition who spoke about purification as a prerequisite for clear spiritual perception may not have been describing something about the relationship between the quality of what we carry in our bodies and the clarity with which we are able to perceive and receive what the divine is always already offering. You are not a person who occasionally interacts with sacred water. You are a person who is primarily made of it. The boundary between you and water is not where you think it is. You are the water that has become conscious and is moving through the world in a particular shape for a particular time. When your ancestors called water sacred, they were not being superstitious. They were being precise. And when you stand at the edge of the ocean and feel something you cannot name, you are not projecting meaning into an indifferent substance. You are water recognizing water. You are the ocean looking at itself. Let that land wherever it needs to land. There is a question worth asking before we close this episode. How did we get from here to there? From the Nile as a living god to the Nile as irrigation system and a receptacle for industrial waste. From sacred wells as portals to the divine to water as a commodity bottled at the source, sold back to the people who live near it, and priced out of reach for communities whose aquifers have been depleted by corporate extraction. From the understanding that water is a relative deserving of relationship and reciprocity to the legal framework in which water is property, owned and traded and denied. That journey did not happen accidentally. It happened alongside the broader desacralization of the natural world that accompanied the rise of industrial capitalism and the particular strain of Western theology that separated the divine from the material, that located God outside creation rather than within it. And that defined human dominion over earth as license for unlimited extraction rather than responsibility for careful stewardship. When you stop perceiving water as sacred, as alive, as a being with its own integrity and its own rights, it becomes much easier to treat it as a resource. And resources exist to be used. The consequences of that shift are not abstract. Communities around the world, disproportionately indigenous communities and communities of color, are living with contaminated water supplies, depleted aquifers, and rivers that no longer run because the water has been diverted to serve agricultural or industrial interests that hold more legal weight than the people and ecosystems downstream. The water protectors at Standing Rock in 2016, the Anishinaabe grandmothers who walk thousands of miles carrying water in ceremony, the communities in Flint, Michigan, who spent years drinking poisoned water while institutional systems failed them, are all living in the consequences of a world that forgot what water is. Says who that water is a commodity? Says who that the sacred wells belong to whomever owns the land above them? Says who that the rivers are resources to be managed rather than living relatives to be honored? Says who that your access to clean water is contingent on your economic standing or your proximity to industrial interests? Says who that the God who separated the waters in Genesis, who sent the flood as cosmic reset, who called the waters good, who moved over the face of the deep before anything else existed, intended for that water to be bottled and sold for profit while children in the same country drink lead? The reclamation this episode is pointing toward is not only personal and spiritual, it is relational and political. It asks us to recover the understanding that water is not ours to own. We are waters. We came from it. We are made of it. We return to it. The most honest relationship we can have with water is one of gratitude, reciprocity, and active protection. That looks like blessing the water you drink before you drink it. It looks like standing in the rain with awareness rather than inconvenience. It looks like returning to a body of water that has meaning and simply being present with it without agenda. It looks like picking up litter at a local creek or river as an act of sacred reciprocity rather than environment obligation. It looks like being mindful of water consumption not from guilt, but from genuine recognition that what you are conserving is a living presence that sustains everything you love. And it looks like paying attention to who has access to clean water and who does not, and understanding that as a spiritual and moral question, not only a political one. You do not need a priest to bless your water. You do not need an institution to mediate your relationship with the most sacred substance on earth. You carry that relationship in your body. You were immersed in it before you took your first breath. And every tradition we talked through today, from the Yoruba to the Hindu to the Celtic to the Hebrew to the indigenous nations of Turtle Island, understood what you were only being invited to remember. Water is not something you use. Water is something you belong to. That belonging is yours. It always was. We started today at the edge of something large. That feeling you get when you stand near water and something in you settles and recognizes and stirs all at once. We have spent this episode trying to understand what that feeling is pointing at, and what we have found is that it is pointing at something real from every direction we looked. The physics of water tells us it is already the most anomalous and rule-defying substance in the known world before we ever get to questions of the consciousness or the sacred. The structured water researchers Pollock, John, DeMeo, each working from different frameworks and different levels of mainstream acceptance, are converging on the intuition that water is more dynamic, more structurally responsive, and more biologically active than the standard chemistry classroom has taught us. Emoto and Austin raise open questions about water's responsiveness to human intention that have never been answered by rigorous science and deserve to be held at exactly that, genuine open questions worth sitting with honestly. The water deities and creation narratives of virtually every human tradition point to the same recognition. That water is not a backdrop to life, but its source, its medium, its threshold, and its most fundamental sacred presence. And the biology tells us that we are not observers of all of this. We are participants in it. We are primarily made of the very substance every tradition has recognized as sacred, and every cutting-edge water researcher is finding to be stranger and more remarkable than previously understood. I want to close with something simple. The next time you drink a glass of water, take one moment before you do. Hold it. Feel the weight of it. Remember that it may have been part of a glacier, a river, a rainstorm, a sea that no longer exists. Remember that the earth may generate water from within itself as a living process. Remember that your brain and your eyes and your blood are primarily this. And if you are someone who prays, pray over it. Not because I can prove that it changes its molecular structure, but because every tradition that has ever taken water seriously understood that the relationship between human intuition and water is worth honoring. And because the act of pausing before you consume something sacred is itself a form of remembering who you are and where you came from. You came from water. I bless my water. I love my water, and I thank it. You are water, and the water you are is worthy of the same reverence your ancestors offered to the ocean, the river, the sacred well, and the rain. So when I bless my water and thank it and love it, I also do that to myself, because we are water. As always, I love you, I see you, and none of us are left behind. Until next time, may your path be aligned, your gnosis be clear, and the veil be ever thin. Our journey continues. Thanks for all the love and support, you beautiful souls.